at Royal Holloway, University of London, and welcome to tonight's event, which is on remembering the death marches. And this event is associated with the exhibition Death Marches, Evidence and Memory, which I co-curated with Christine Schmidt from the Wiener Holocaust Library. And the exhibition is being shown there at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and also at the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre at the University of Huddersfield. And you can get tickets to either of those places if they are anywhere near where you can get to at the moment. So tonight's chair is Andy Mycock and from the University of Huddersfield, and I'll introduce him in a moment. Just a couple of words of housekeeping. First of all, to say everybody will be kept on mute throughout the evening, but feel free to post any comments or questions in the chat. After the discussion, we'll try and get to as many of the questions as we can within the time, and we'll stay on for 5 or 10 minutes after 7 if there are enough questions. We've turned on auto captioning for accessibility. Feel free to switch it off if you don't need it, but if you do, please note that it doesn't always quite accurately capture what's being said, especially on this topic with names of places and people and so on. So if it does anything a bit strange, you'll know why. And also to add that Imogen, our colleague at the Wiener Holocaust Library, will be adding various terms and links in the chat throughout the discussion. If you have any technical difficulties, please send Imogen a direct message, and she and Christine and I can try and help. Finally, to say that the event is recorded, but your camera will not appear on screen, and the recording will be available on the Wiener Holocaust Library's YouTube channel in the next day or two. Okay, so to introduce tonight's chair, Andy Mycock is a reader in politics at the University of Huddersfield, and he's co-founder of the Academy for British and Irish Studies based at Huddersfield. He's interested in issues of ethnicity and nationalism, dictatorship and democracy, the politics of the European Union, film and cinema, the legacy of the British Empire, the impact of devolution, immigration and multiculturalism, and contemporary politics across the Commonwealth. So I'll hand over to Andy, who will get us started. Thanks.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this, what is in the United Kingdom at Leeds, a very rare sweltering evening. I'm speaking to you from Manchester in the north of England, and it is a balmy 27 degrees. So forgive my less than official dress this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. The University of Huddersfield has based the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre on the campus since 2018, which was set up in partnership with the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association. And the Exhibition and Learning Centre there welcomes thousands of visitors, particularly young people, every year to learn more about not only the history of the Holocaust, but also its commemoration and remembrance. And my work intersects with that. I've been working over the last decade on looking at the politics of war commemoration in particular, and particularly the way in which the First and Second World Wars are commemorated across what is known as the Anglosphere, or the English-speaking world. But my work also intersects with the idea about how young people intersect and connect with history and citizenship education. And it's interesting to talk about the death marches this evening, our subject, which is, of course, the subject of the exhibition, which is on at the Wiener Library Museum at the moment. It's an interesting area because it's just been described as one which is overlooked and under studies. A last murderous eruption of the Holocaust in many ways. Dr. Christine Schmidt describes what we see as mobile concentration camps. And we know that hundreds of thousands of people were affected by the death marches, and indeed significant numbers of people died. I think the interesting thing about it is that there are really 3 stages to the death marches. It's not one simple phenomena. There are different phases in 1944, in early 1945, and then in the last days of the Second World War. And also that the idea of the death marches is broken down by the idea of what modes of transport we use. This was something which is experienced by rail, by ship, and on foot. But I think most significantly in many ways is the death marches challenge the notion that the Holocaust was simply a product of industrial genocide. It highlights the murderous extent to which person on person, that this was something around villages and towns and people, and the way in which that intersects with that more significant narrative. And this evening, we're very fortunate to have a panel which comes from different perspectives, from academia, from education, and from the world of arts. And we've asked our speakers if they'd just spend a couple of minutes introducing themselves first before we begin. So I'd like to invite Ms. Susanna Silas first to just describe a little bit about her own work. Susan.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I've actually watched all of the previous ones, and I'm truly impressed by all, and only wish that I could see the 2 exhibitions in person. I also want to apologize for not speaking extemporaneously. I know that's preferable, but I find that I'm too unreliable as a speaker without notation. We were given the questions in advance, and so I have written out my responses to be sure that I cover the things that I think are the most important, rather than speaking on the fly. I'm a visual artist, and my concerns are about embodiment, feminism, and how historical forces intersect with the personal. My project, Helmbrecht's Walk 1998 to 2003, is the documentation of my tracing on foot the steps of a death march that began in Helmbrechts in southern Germany and ended 22 days and 225 miles later in the town of Prahatica, which is now in the Czech Republic. A web version of the work and ancillary materials can be found at helmbrechtswalk.com. This project has been exhibited in Pittsburgh and at Stony Brook, in Toronto, Vienna, in Silja in Slovenia, in Neuenhaus, Germany, and in New York City. It is the subject of a chapter in 3 books: Landscape and Holocaust Memory by the scholar Brett Ashley Kaplan, Memory Effects, The Holocaust and the Art of Secondary Witnessing by Dora Appel, and The Power of Place, Photographing the Holocaust Today by Bettina Lokman. It is cited in numerous other books and publications and dissertations, and is in fact cited by a previous panelist, Roma Sendika, in A Journey, the Pain of Others in Historical Experience, Susan Silas, that appeared in the RIHA journal. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to also invite Tim Cole, who's Professor of Social History and the Director of the Brigstow Institute at the University of Bristol, just to introduce his own work.
Thanks. Maybe following on from Susan, I'll start with Susan's work. Susan's work is one that also is a focus of some of my own writing. So I was interested in thinking a bit about how Susan's own retracing of one death march linked with something that Angela's going to talk about a little bit later, the March of the Living, that I think is well known to many, and something that probably is less well known, something called March of Life, which is a kind of retracing of death march routes by charismatic Christians from Germany. So I was interested in this idea really of the kind of symbolic retracing of death march routes and claims to authenticity or not. And that's something I think that Susan will talk about a little bit later on. My own work has really started off by being interested much more in fixed sites within the Holocaust. So my earlier work has been mainly on ghettos. So I've been really interested in much more kind of static Holocaust landscapes. But I guess over time, I've gradually broadened out to be interested as well in more mobile sites. And so I guess in a book called Holocaust Landscapes, I talk in there about the death marches. And the way that I think about them is I think about them in some ways as more of a continuity maybe than they've been thought of before with the concentration camp period. So really thinking a bit about the death marches as, in a sense, the whole camps going onto the road are kind of camps on the move. So not just the prisoners, but also the guards, and in a sense, almost the kind of structures of a camp. And I think sometimes in Dan Blackman's work, I think there's almost too much of a distinction drawn between the camp period and the death march period. And I'd suggest there's more of a continuity, that sure, the barbed wire fence has gone, but in a sense, the barbed wire fence is replaced with a new kind of barrier, a new kind of boundary, which is the sightlines of the guards. And that becomes the critical thing for survivors, is to look for the moment when no one is looking as a chance to escape. But there's also something much more deadly about this way that a camp itself takes onto the road, and that the barbed wire fences disappear and become these sightlines of guards. because escape from the camp becomes reimagined. You know, in the context of the camp, I think escape is about trying to breach the boundaries of the camp. Whereas on the road, escape becomes just no longer walking. So the act of escape becomes redefined, and it's enough just to fall to your knees or to fall to the ground to then be shot and be deemed to be trying to escape from this mobile camp on the road. So I've been interested in all my work around thinking about Holocaust landscapes, both in a historical sense and also in a memory sense. And so as well as writing about tourist visits to camps and ghettos, I was really intrigued when I came across Susan's work and reflecting on the ways in which individuals have also tried in some ways to trace the roots of the death marches, and that's very much going to be the focus of our conversation, I think, this evening.
Thanks, Tim. That's much appreciated. I'd like to also introduce Professor Jens Christian Wagner, who's Professor of History and Media and Public at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena. Professor Wagner, would you like to introduce yourself and your work? Oh, I think you're on mute. Apologies.
I'm sorry. So I'm not only professor at the University of Jena, but also director of the Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp memorial foundation. And I've been director of the Lower Saxony Memorials Foundation for some 7 years before I came to Thuringia, where I'm now. Well, I've worked and made some research about a lot of death marches and evacuation transports, not only from the concentration camps but also from prisons. I think it's important to widen our perspective on the death marches. There were not only death marches when the concentration camps were closed and the prisoners were sent to the center of the German Reich, but also other categories of camps were closed. Civil workers' camps, forced labor camps for Jews, camps for Sinti and Roma, the prisons, and so on. So in all my work, I have tried to have an integral view on the broad scope of Nazi crimes, not only on the Holocaust. Unfortunately, I couldn't see your exhibition, which is on stage, as I understood, at Huddersfield now, or at the Weiner Library. I don't know exactly. Or both of them?
Both.
Both, okay. But some 5 or 6 years ago, I made an exhibition about the death marches from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, which was situated in the Harz Mountains, in the center of Germany, to Bergen-Belsen. Nearly all the prisoners of the Dora concentration camp were sent to Belsen in April 1945. And yes, some years ago we made an exhibition about that with a small booklet, from Harz to Heath, death marches and evacuation transports in April 1945. Okay.
Professor Wagner, thank you very much for that introduction to your work. That's very much appreciated. And our final speaker this evening is going to be Angela Gluck, and Angela is going to introduce some of her work. She's working very much with the March for the Living. So Angela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's a great honor to be here and a real privilege to represent March of the Living. So my entire background has been in education. I'm a schools advisor and a teacher trainer, but a lot of my work has involved Holocaust education, mainly in secondary schools and with young adults. But since its inception, I've been involved with March of the Living UK. It began internationally. Well, actually, it was stimulated and generated from Israel, but it began in 1988. But there wasn't a UK delegation until 2010, and I've been an educator on those trips ever since. I think I want to say, first of all, that it isn't specifically about death marches. It is a way of trying to experience the effects of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. March of the Living, in particular, the UK branch, emphasizes education about the communities that were affected, not only about their death, but about their life. So in the case of Poland, there is a 1,000-year, broadly speaking, very, very painless, relatively speaking, I should say, a very painless experience with a great deal of coexistence and a flowering of Jewish culture. So part of what we try to do in March of the Living is to appreciate that heritage, to understand it for its own sake, but also to see what was lost, not simply that Jews were killed or Sinti Roma were killed or others were killed, but actually what was the culture that was lost. And we do this by having about a week, or perhaps a little less than a week, touring the country and looking at what remains of the pre-Holocaust Jewish life, and to some extent the current Jewish life in Poland. March of the Living takes place on what is called in the Jewish calendar Yom HaZikaron HaShoah U'Gevurah, literally the day of remembering the Holocaust and heroism. And it was the date was chosen in relation to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and so it tries to emphasize not simply that people were victimized, but also that there were acts of great heroism, of bravery, of kindness, and of solidarity. And so that's why that date was chosen, rather than the 27th of January, which is a date about liberation by others, by the so to speak, the non-victims. So that itself is very significant. It's about, pardon the cliche, it's about empowerment, and it involves literally walking from Auschwitz I to what is sometimes called Auschwitz II or Birkenau. Let me just briefly show you an image of this kind of walk. There we go. I hope you can see that kind of walk there along a disused railway between the two. It's just a few kilometers. It takes a very long time, because there's 12,000 or more people actually walking or marching, some in silence, some singing psalms or freedom songs, some just chatting gently. And sometimes people join in from as it were, the countryside. Polish nationals will join in the march, along with these delegations from, well, we say every continent except Antarctica. We haven't got the penguins there yet, but they do come from Europe and North America, in particular, also South America, Australia, and various parts of Asia and Africa. And so it is literally an attempt to reverse the death marches. Death marches involved taking people out of the physical limitations of the camp with a disregard for their life. They might survive the journey, they might not. It was almost immaterial, perhaps, whether they survived or they didn't. But what we are doing on the march is walking back into Birkenau, as if to say, well, we have survived. We are still here. We are able to walk. And then there is an event at the end of that march in Birkenau itself, which is closed to the public for the day. So is Auschwitz I, by the way. And it is a cross between a religious service and a community gathering and I don't know, pop concert, or it is a very strange kind of genre, if you like, of events. But it is a statement about life and continuity and survival.
Many thanks for that, Angela. That's very powerful and very interesting to hear of the whole process. It's very interesting. Please do feel, if you've got any questions for our panel, please do submit them. We have got a number of questions which we've posed for them just to start off the conversation this evening. And the first question is one really coming from the interest about remembrance and commemoration. And I asked the panel to think about to what extent do they feel that the remembrance of the death marches was distinctive in terms of the wider commemoration of the Holocaust. And I wonder if I can ask Professor Cull first, maybe to address that question.
I'm sure. I mean, I think there is something distinctive about the remembrance of the death marches in that it's distinctive by its lack of remembrance or its relative lack of remembrance within the kind of popular sphere. I mean, I think broadly speaking, and this is a kind of this is a simplification, so bear with me with the simplification. Broadly speaking, I think in my sense is that if you think about the Western world, if you think of Britain and you think of North America, broadly speaking, I think there's been a kind of shift in the memorial landscapes from originally the landscapes liberated by British and American troops, places like Dachau or Bergen-Belsen, in the immediate post-war period. If you think of the immediate post-war period, there's a kind of focus upon those camps that are liberated, by the British and the American troops. There's gradually a shift to more focus on the camps liberated by the Soviets, and in particular Auschwitz-Birkenau, that you see, I think, around the 1960s and into the 1970s. So you see, if you kind of just trace the use of language, I think Belsen in British discourse shifts to become Auschwitz, increasingly by the 1960s. And I think the trial of Adolf of Eichmann is very important there. Then I guess there's a shift later on, post 1989, to the focus on the Holocaust by bullets, as it's termed, the face-to-face killings, Einsatzgruppen within the former Soviet territory. And in some ways, I think there's a sense in which the death marches, the evacuations, become something that becomes part of a kind of later, I think really 1990s, 2000s moment. So in a sense, the exhibition that's on at the moment in Wiener Library or in Huddersfield, I don't think would have happened in 1950s or 60s or 70s. There was a Belsen exhibition, in that period, or there was an Auschwitz exhibition a little bit later, or there was a focus on the Holocaust by bullets. So in some ways, I think the very fact that this is happening now says something about how there's been a shift. And so maybe I could just start with that sense of there's a distinctive chronology to the memory, which is a distinctive chronology. And maybe a little bit later, I'll say something about a distinctive geography, which is about the fact that this is so dispersed, that it's hard to pin this down, because it covers, as Jens will tell us, I'm sure, about the evacuations in the region that he knows well, that this uses lots of different roads and rail tracks within the region, rather than having a kind of focus in the way that somewhere like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising or the killings at somewhere like Belsen or Auschwitz does.
Thank you, Tim. That very much that point about the fluidity and the way in which geography changes. Professor Wagner, you focused very much on the history of concentration camps. In that context about the death marches, how does that change the narrative of our understanding of the Holocaust, that fluidity and that shift in geography? Do you think it provides us with a distinctive challenge in terms of commemoration? Oh.
It's a question for me, not?
That's right, yes.
Yes, okay. So I think despite the broad research made by historians like Clemens Winter or Daniel Blattman, I'm sure you know his different works, until today we don't know enough about the history of the death marches. Some routes of these death marches are still unknown. A lot of graves have not been located yet. And we don't know the total number of the victims. For example, as I told you, the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp has been evacuated in the beginning of April 1945. And actually, we don't know how many people died during these death marches. We estimate that there were some 40,000 prisoners who were sent to these death marches, most of them to Bergen-Belsen, and we estimate that some 8,000 to 10,000 did not survive. But actually, we don't know exactly, and we don't know their names. There are a lot of people who are missing, and well, if someone is missing and we know he was sent on a death march, you can be quite sure that he didn't survive the death march. But we don't know where the graves are, where these people have been buried along the death march roads. So there's a lot of research still to be done. This is my first point. My second point is, I think that's, like I said in some minutes ago, that it's important to emphasize that the death marches were not a sub-chapter of the Holocaust. For example, Daniel Goldhagen, in my opinion, was completely wrong when he described the massacre of Gardelegen as a part of the Holocaust in his book, Willing Executioners, because most of the 1,000 concentration camp prisoners killed in Gardelegen on the 13th of April 1945 were non-Jewish political prisoners from Poland, the Soviet Union, from France and Belgium. So I think we must widen our perspective, as I said before, on other groups of victims. We need an integral view on the whole scope of the policy of persecution and extermination of the Nazis.
That's fascinating, to open that historical lens and explore the full complexity of the challenges of understanding the death marches and commemorating them. And in that sense, Susan, your work has looked very much in the role of gender and how gender can shape those acts of commemoration, and particularly your own work retracing some of the steps of the death marches. I wonder whether you'd like to say something about how that reshapes possibly that understanding of the distinctiveness of the death marches.
Well, can you see my screen now?
We can indeed, yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. I do talk about that too, but I did prepare some remarks, so which include the fact that I did pick this march in particular to retrace because it was all women. That was not an incidental thing, and because I feel that the history of the Holocaust has been primarily written by Western men. But I did prepare a little something to say about the sort of more general question about commemoration, which I thought I would say now. And that is that one obvious distinction to be made about the death marches is their spatial and temporal aspect. And it makes it feel as if a representation should be cinematic in nature. This is a map representing the march route from Helmbrechts to Villari of a group of women prisoners in the spring of '45 that I retraced on foot in 1998, covering 225 miles. I should quickly mention that this was, for some prisoners, the continuation of a much longer march that terminated in Helmbrechts shortly before this one began, and that Yad Vashem has a detailed online exhibition about the full scope of this march, which was presented on an earlier panel by Yona Kobo. So due to their spatial and diverse nature, as a practical consequence, we see acknowledgements of the remembrances of the death marches at the beginning. Oops, what's happening here? At the beginning, which this is Helmbrechts, where every year there's a commemoration by the townspeople to commemorate the start of the march. And this is the plaque that you see in the background there. But essentially we see, as someone else mentioned, indication of what happened along these march routes, nothing to indicate what transpired or where exactly prisoners were murdered en route. And here we see the end of the route. This is a remembrance stone in Villari. In these marches, I see a metaphor for the return of the repressed, inasmuch as this hidden thing inside the camps, though of course widely known despite denials, bursts into the public sphere when the activity of camps is displaced onto public thoroughfares, although the guards do try to stay on less traveled roads and out of the center of towns as much as possible, even though I went straight through Marienbad. There's also a strange contradiction in that the process of hiding the prisoners from the Allies is precisely what makes them public to the local populace. In the case of the march from Helmbrechts to Prahatitsa, whose endpoint is usually referred to as Valari, where some surviving women were hospitalized and where 95 of those who died along the march route are buried, the fact that all of the prisoners were women makes a mockery of Himmler's concern that the prisoners must be removed because they would rampage through the local towns and rape German women. And one could say of those late marches in the spring of 45, that they have the feel of a public confession of wrongdoing, inasmuch as the war was effectively over and the last remaining rationales had more to do with silencing witnesses and perhaps the far-fetched notion of a hostage exchange rather than the movement of forced laborers for strategic purposes, which seemed to be more plausible rationale earlier when many prisoners were moved by train from camp to camp. My decision to retrace this march entirely on foot, just get the next picture here, sorry, beginning and ending my day where the prisoners did in 1945, based on the evidence from the trial of Alois Dor, the commandant in charge, which did not take place till the mid-60s in Germany, and to document the landscape where these events transpired was one way to not only memorialize these women in a non-monumental way, but also to try and look at the landscape of the everyday and take up its hidden and unremarked history. In this decision, I was influenced by the filmmakers Jean-Marie Straub and Danielle Huillet, and two British artists, both born immediately after the war, Hamish Fulton and Richard Long, who made works of a conceptual nature by walking through the landscape and marking and documenting their passage through it. So I'm going to show you a couple of images here of my days walking through the landscape. This is obviously not all of them. As a note, each pair represents one day. The top images of me looking down the road, the below images of what's in my peripheral vision. The top caption is a diary of my experiences, and the bottom caption is one of a news item from that day. And this is 53 years to the day that the events transpired. And believe it or not, this cross was out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Susan. That was really interesting, and it's interesting how you can see that geography matters in the way in which the sites of commemoration change, and they have a very powerful impact on that. I think in some ways it also highlights another question which I'd like to pose to the panel, which is about, are there any specific challenges in the study of the history and also in the commemoration of the death marches? And again, probably starts with Professor Cole, if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been hinted at already by other panelists in a number of ways. I think Jens is absolutely right to emphasize the fact that the death marches involve a whole host of different prisoner populations. And so in a sense, it really does muddy a kind of view of the Holocaust as a specifically targeted attack on the Jewish people. That's certainly very much at the center of, say, the Einsatzgruppen killings as they evolve and they shift from being primarily of political partisans to increasingly not just Jewish men, but Jewish women and Jewish children. And then obviously within the Operation Reinhard camps, places like Belzec or Treblinka, what you see there is you see the mass killing of Jewish men and women and children. But I think there's a sense in which, as the war evolves, there's a kind of shift towards not just mass killing of Jews, but Jews being placed into slave labor. You see that increasingly in 43, especially 44. And so what you get to at the point where the death marches, the evacuations take place, is a much more diverse labor force within the camp system of Europe. It's Slavs, and it's Jews, it's politicals, you know, it's a really diverse group of individuals. And so the evacuation to the camps, these very diverse camps, when they're being evacuated, it's all sorts of people being evacuated, it's all sorts of prisoners. And so I think it's one of those points where, in a sense, we can't just talk about this being, it is part of the Holocaust experience of many survivors, but it's actually a much broader experience. And it's one, I think Jens talked about the word integrated. I think that's really important, that sense of a kind of integrating, if you like, the Jewish experience and the Jewish story with the stories of other people group. And that's certainly something that you see within the ITS archive that Dan has worked on extensively, that as those from the ITS are retracing these death march routes, what they're identifying is they're identifying the graves of people who are Jewish and non-Jewish, who are all on the roads of Europe. And it's interesting, if you look at the survivors' narrative, survivors are very conscious of this, that they talk about how the road network of Europe is clogged at this point in time, because it's political prisoners and Jewish prisoners and slave laborers, but it's also the German military is also rapidly retreating, and it's refugees, German refugees who are streaming from the east. So in a sense, everyone's on the move. There's lots of people on the road network. And this is one of the points, I think, where in a sense you're seeing a road network that's dominated by a military retreat and a pulling of military and non-military personnel. And so this is a kind of really complex story, and these are really complex sites. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face, as well as the fact that there's just loads of roads everywhere. And as Jens has pointed out, we don't know which roads they are yet. You know, there's lots of challenges about sources because there's not much paperwork. But I think Jens is right to point to the sense that actually this is a moment where I think it calls for us to reframe the Holocaust in some ways, or to reimagine the chronology of the Holocaust, and to think about actually, there's a sense in which, you know, I often talk about the idea that the Holocaust is a genocide that moves through the European landscape and changes shape as it moves, and it's really unraveling in really important and significant ways. And actually, what's happening on the road network of Europe is much more complex than the story of just Jewish persecution.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting, that sort of intersection there of Jewish and different ethnic groups and different national groups in terms of how commemoration is dealt with in the death marches.
May I add something?
Yes, of course. I was just going to
okay. So if the victims of the death marches had only been Jews, it would be very much easier to explain why so much people were killed on the death marches, because actually there's no doubt that it was the plan, it was the program of the Nazis to kill, to exterminate all the Jews from Europe. But if many of the victims of the death marches were not Jews, were political prisoners from Western Europe, who were quite high in a quite high level in the racist hierarchy of the Nazis, we need other answers to the question, why did so many people die on these death marches? Why were so many people murdered on these death marches? And to answer this question, I think we have to widen our perspective on the German society during National Socialism, a society which based on two columns, first inclusion and second exclusion. And in my opinion, an important part of the inclusion as well as the exclusion was the criminalization of all people who were outside the so-called people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. And concentration camp inmates and forced laborers were presented by the Nazi propaganda as dangerous criminals, as threat for the innere Sicherheit, the public security. And I think many Germans, most of the Germans, believed in that. They thought that the liberated prisoners, Jews and forced laborers, would threat the German population with looting, murder, in the moment they would be liberated. And for this reason, the Germans tried to prevent the liberation of these so-called criminals. And I think for this reason, they sent them on these evacuation transports and death marches, and they killed them when these marches had ended in a dead road, like in Gardeling, because Gardeling during this massacre was surrounded by American troops. There was no way out. And to prevent, it's absurd, but it's Nazi logic, to prevent that these prisoners would be liberated and would be a threat to the German population. They were killed in the last hour before the American troops entered. And I think this is one answer. But I think Tim Cole, you are quite right. The phenomenon of the death marches is much more complex than we might think. And so the answer to the question, why these people were sent to the death marches, why so many people were murdered, is a very complex one.
Thank you for that, Professor Wagner. It shows the extent of the indoctrination and propaganda across German society in many ways then. But Angela, you wanted to just come in and say something about this as well.
Yes, I do. It's not so much about the route. I can't claim to have such expertise about the routes or even about the ignorance about routes. But I do want to say something, this may sound strange, about shoes. Because there are collections of shoes in Majdanek, for example, and also in Auschwitz, gathered together in Auschwitz I, which is now a sort of museum. And in case people aren't aware, I think the shoes were left behind because they're very difficult things to pass on in a second-hand kind of way. You know, we might take somebody else's clothes if they've been laundered, but what are you going to do with filthy old shoes? And so we have in both those places and elsewhere mounds of shoes, and they sort of languished there. And when I'm guiding in Majdanek and also in Auschwitz I spend quite a bit of time talking about these shoes, because actually what you see are really cages of shoes, now really quite dusty, but they are extraordinarily varied. So there are working boots and children's booties and ladies' dancing shoes and little girls' sandals and court shoes and all kinds of shoes. And they are an extraordinary symbol of the diversity of those who were murdered there or who were otherwise victimized there, and whose lives became intertwined. There are just piles. In the piles, you know, you don't see even complete pairs. There probably is the other one somewhere else, but who knows? There are just these piles of stuff that maybe could have been used for the Reich in some way, but who knows what. And so they languished there. And I often, although we don't do death marches, I often see these shoes as the walkers, you know, the ones that could have been, who walked there and who could be walking out of there afterwards. And there's a great deal of poetry, of course, and artistic representation of these shoes, because I think shoes also, just one last thing I want to say, is that they're very sort of intimate. You know, there's something, they're more intimate than a shirt or a coat. They mold to your feet. They become quite individual. They can't be passed on. They remain who you are. And I see those mounds of shoes or those cages of shoes as really a memorial to the marches that is left behind.
Could I just go in there on shoes, Andy? Because it's, I mean, what's interesting, I think, is if you look at the survivor testimony, survivors talk a lot about shoes, especially when it comes to the death marches, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
You know, because obviously footwear matters always. In Auschwitz, footwear mattered. You know, but it especially mattered in the death marches. And so one of the things that people talk about is the first thing to go from a corpse that is shot at the side of the road are the shoes, the boots, because actually that's what you need is to survive. I think one of the things, if you think about the footwear at Auschwitz, it's often wooden clogs, which are a disaster in the death marches in January 1945. People talk about slipping and sliding down the roads. It's not a march, it's more a kind of slipping and sliding. And so what you really want is to try and get hold of leather boots if you can. And I think one of the things that often survivors talk about is the value of being one of the more privileged prisoners who ended up in the Canada part of Auschwitz, which is where they're sorting the clothes that are coming in, which are then being sent back to the Reich. Although obviously many of them don't end up in the Reich for various reasons, I think largely because of the rapidity of the Soviet advance to Majdanek in July 44. But in a sense, what's really crucial is that you have clothing and footwear that you can get hold of if you're going to be able to survive the death marches. And one thing I've been really interested in is the way that when survivors talk about these, they'll sometimes focus in on details that we might feel are really unimportant. There's one interview that I listened to where a guy goes into incredible detail about finding a tiny bit of waxed cloth in one of the barns where they slept for the night along the route of the death marches. And it's a kind of thing that you see the interviewer getting a bit bored because they want to start talking about, something really important. But he's really focusing in on this tiny little, inch square of waxed cloth. And he focuses on that because it's the thing that he uses to cushion his foot, because he knows what it feels like to walk in an ill-fitting pair of shoes, and that actually this is the thing that in a sense he says saves him, that something so insignificant becomes so significant because of the very nature of this movement.
I could add one other small thing to that, which is that there's a beautiful passage in Primo Levi's book. It might be in the first one, or it might be in The Drowned and the Saved, in which he describes liberation, and he's made a Greek friend who's also a camp prisoner. And the Greek friend has organized for himself a pair of fantastic boots. And Primo Levi has like ragged shoes on his feet. And, to which this Greek companion says to him that anybody with shoes like Primo Levi has on is a fool, to which Primo Levi says he thinks that that's the most brilliant thing he ever heard, comparing them. And also that in my readings too, it's incredible how often someone says that what they had on their feet saved their life when they left their home, and that the women who had boots on, right, survived in greater numbers than the ones who had flimsy shoes when they left their home.
I think that's really interesting to get that sort of personal sense in which shoes as an item become very symbolic of a much wider challenge, as well as a symbolic sense of that remembrance. We've had a few questions in from the audience, which I'm sure between our esteemed guests we can address. The first one is unfortunately, I've not got the names of the questioners, so I can apologise for that. But they said, for the non-academics in this field, could you please give us an indication of how many miles per day were walked during the death marches? Where did food come from, if food was indeed at all an option? And what was the percentage of those that undertook the death marches, the different forms, that actually survived?
I can address just a teeny bit of that, in as much as Alois Dorr's trial transcript from the 60s maps out, and I repeat, the length of time that these women walked for this particular march from Helmbergs to Villari, and it was different every day. There were days that I walked 3 kilometers and days that I walked 25 kilometers based on what they did back in 1945. So I think the whole thing was pretty haphazard. I think at the very end, the marches that I'm, considering, which are in the late spring of 45, a lot of times these people didn't even know where they were supposed to be taking their prisoners. I mean, it was pretty, I think, chaotic. And while I don't think they were fed much most of the time. There was an incident on this march where a town heard that these women were going to be coming through the town. I think it's Domalica, and they got dressed up in their like traditional finery and came out with like really rich food, sausages, all kinds of stuff. And this was toward the end of the march, and these women were pretty starved by then. And the woman that I talked to for many hours after I did this walk, Helena Kleiner, who was a survivor, said that there was the guards immediately started hitting their hands with batons to prevent them from getting any of the food, and food was spilling all over the ground, and that she and her girlfriend got a small piece of bread. But the women who actually ate the sausages and the speck and all this rich food died because they weren't able to absorb that kind of food by then. And so that's a sort of sadder story of the relationship to food toward the end of these marches.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, I think on food, Susan's totally right about, you know, as she says, they're really chaotic. So the routes are chaotic. The amount of miles per day is really variable. In terms of food, I think a lot of it is about requisitioning of barns at night to act as a place for prisoners to sleep. So you don't have the barracks on the road. What you have is a large barn that you take over and then cram, say, 5,000 prisoners into the large barn, and then requisition whatever food stuff is available, but it's a low priority. So feeding prisoners is a very low priority within the evacuations.
Thanks, Jim. Angela, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
No, I don't think there's a great deal. I mean, I just want to just emphasize that it is such a blur. There's so much that we know for certain, and this is an area where we know very little. We know very little, but I think also that there is a sense of pointlessness. There is a pointlessness about this, which does not exist to the same extent in camps. Certainly in labor camps. Perhaps obviously in extermination camps there is a point, but this seems to be so aimless, so chaotic, so desperate. So, oh, what are we going to do now? Just better get out and go somewhere. And this is, as you said yourself, you know, the war was as good as over. You know, when we had the liberation of Majdanek in the summer of July of 44, and then it kind of it's downhill all the way, and so I guess that explains it really, but it does make it very difficult for us to have a map in any sense. I don't mean just a geographical map, but a kind of a mental map of what is this about really? Is it just to move people from camp A to camp B? Well, no. What is it then? I think we're a lot in the dark still.
That's interesting. It brings in another couple of questions which I'd like to direct to Professor Wagner, if possible, which have come from the audience. And the first one says, forgive the potentially oversimplistic view, but why didn't the Nazis, the retreating Nazis, simply leave the camp inmates where they were? Why did they invest so much effort into moving them across different parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe? And secondly, why were those Germans who were not sympathetic to the Nazi cause, why didn't they help free those on the death marches as they came through their villages and towns?
I think the last question is very easy to answer. Most of the Germans were in favor of the Nazis. So the few ones who were against the Nazi regime didn't have the opportunity and the chance to free the prisoners. And the first question, I think this is a complex thing, but first of all, there are, I think, two things to mention why they didn't leave them behind when the SS left the camps. First of all, even in February and March of 1945, the Nazis thought that it would be possible to have the Endsieg, the final victory, and if they wanted to win the war, they needed the forced laborers from the camps for the German armaments industry. By the way, at this moment, there wasn't, the German armaments industry was nearly down. But this is another thing. In their minds, this industry still existed. And in their minds, this has a lot to do with a loss of reality. And there was a big loss of reality in the not only in the head of Hitler, but also in the head of the generals of the Wehrmacht, in the head of Albert Speer, and all the leading Nazis and members of the German government, and also in the heads of people like Werner von Braun, who was an engineer. But even those people worked with the aim to obtain the final victory. And to obtain this victory, they needed the forced laborers, and this is one reason why why the SS didn't leave them behind when they left the camps. And the second reason is that in the perspective of the Nazis, these prisoners were dangerous criminals. And their first aim was to prevent that these dangerous criminals were liberated and would be a threat to the German population. And this is, I think, the most important reason for the death marches.
Thank you very much.
Of course, in our perspective, this is it's ridiculous, and it's but in the logic of the Nazis, in the thinking of the Nazis, in the ideology of the Nazis, this was logic.
It's remarkably powerful to think about quite how ingrained that sense of fear of the unknown was forced through by Nazi propaganda during and before the Second World War. We are running close to our end. I think we might run about 5 minutes over, just to warn our participants in case their lunch, if they're in New York, or their tea is just bubbling away in Europe. But one question that I wanted to ask, and it's a personal question which is linked to my own work, which is, in 2009, the last combatant on the First World War, Harry Patch, died. And I remember that the front page of the British Economist magazine said that the commemoration of the First World War went from memory to history. And there was a sense of that transferal. And of course, we are in a period where, sadly, the last survivors of the death marches are sadly passing away. And so that same effect is in many ways happening in terms of how we might think about and commemorate the death marches, as we see that direct memory shift to history. I just wonder if I could ask all our participants in many ways to think about, what do you think that potential impact might be in the way in which we remember and commemorate the death marches? And particularly in terms of Andros, if it's okay, I shall come to you last. What does it mean in terms of passing on our knowledge of understanding to future generations? Professor Cole, Tim, do you think you could start first?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a broader context. I think there's a kind of anxiety at large about the death of the last survivor, and what that means for, in particular, Holocaust education and Holocaust remembrance, because in many ways the survivor has become the sort of prime teller of the story of the Holocaust. You know, survivor narrative has emerged as the prime discourse. I mean, I think that itself has a history that I'd situate around the time of '61 and the Eichmann trial. So I think it very much is tied to, you know, a decision in the Eichmann trial to foreground survivor voices as central and to create a kind of narrative. You know, I think prior to that, it's a sort of moment that scholars have talked about the move from displaced persons to survivor. And a survivor having a kind of particular role. So in some ways, I'd say that history is a thing where things change. Like, that's kind of what we know from history, is that things always change. And so maybe we'll shift from a kind of displaced person to survivor. We'll shift from survivor to historian. I mean, what fascinates me, I think, is the kind of the sense within this world of kind of Holocaust memory and education of seeing the second generation as the kind of torchbearers. So in a sense, if the survivor generation die, then will the second generation, and then after them the third generation, become those who hold the torch? I mean, to me, that is in a sense, I think, deeply problematic. I think the second generation can tell their own story, but I don't necessarily think they can tell their mother or father's story in the same way that their mother and father can tell it. In some ways, I think survivors and historians are doing very different jobs. Survivors, I think, are very much telling their own story of what happened to them. And I think in the case of the evacuations and death marches, we are really reliant on survivor testimony, because that's where we get the majority of the evidence from. There's relatively little in the way of German documentation. There's some post-war stuff that you find within the ITS archive, that Dan's used in the exhibition, which is really interesting material. But actually, I think we're really largely dependent upon the survivors. But I think the thing that we do as historians is quite a different task. In a sense, we're not trying to tell a story of an individual. We're much more trying to contextualize, to understand, to try and understand what is happening. And so in some ways, I think what we need to do is think about in many ways that actually the historians maybe can be trusted to take on this story, and they'll use survivor narratives in part to inform their analysis. It's just kind of what happens. That's what happens with the past, is that there's a point where the past recedes from living memory and becomes the stuff that historians do something with. There's an inevitability to it that I think we need to embrace rather than to try and fight against.
Thank you. Excellent. Anyone else would like to come in on that?
I definitely don't disagree with, whoops, am I on? I don't disagree with that. I think that I see myself as a secondary witness, in the sense that my parents experienced this, and I don't see my walking through the landscape as in any way helping to enable me to imagine what these women went through. And I think that it's going to be about the transmission of information, and that's going to be very, very important and critical transmission of information. And in that light, I think that commemoration becomes less important than the transmission of information, because once the survivor generation is gone, it seems to me that commemoration is less important than getting people to know what happened, than giving information.
Thanks, Susan. That's a really interesting point.
Probably controversial too, but
no, it's an important one, though. It's certainly an important one. Professor Wagner, do you have any final thoughts on that question?
I don't think he knows you're asking him.
Oh, right. Sorry, Professor Wagner. I was just going to say, do you have any thoughts on that final question, on this passing from memory to history?
Well, I think this is an important thing, especially as at memorials like Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen, because we are doing historical education every day here with groups, especially of young people. And I think that this educational work has to be changed. Until today, the main slogans of this work are "never forget" and "you must remember." But I think in a certain way, we can only remember what we have experienced for ourselves. And most visitors of the concentration camp memorials nowadays are so young that even their grandparents did not experience the war themselves. So for them, the request to remember is, I think, it's morally charged. And I'm afraid that many of these young people are overwhelmed. And it's not our aim to overwhelm the visitors of the concentration camp memorials. So I would like to suggest to replace this kind of remembrance by the term coming to terms with history. And this is another thing. What we need, I think, is historical knowledge and historical consciousness. And this can be created by the study of the historical sources, the written documents, the photographs, and the testimonies. There are so many testimonies of the survivors. And these testimonies will, they will stay. Also when the last survivor will have been died. There are video testimonies, written testimonies, and so on. And all these things, all these historical sources can be used. Of course, one of the most important aims of the work at the memorials like Buchenwald is to honor the victims. But if we want to learn something from history, I think we must ask why they have been made victims and who made them victims. So the slogan, in my opinion, must not be "never again," but "how could that happen?"
It's themes that I resonate very much in my work on the First World War and the commemoration of the First World War. It seems very similar in the structure of that debate. Angela, if you'd like to maybe give us some final thoughts on this, particularly about young people in the next generation and the March of the Living.
I'm going to differ. I'm really going to differ because I think we are fundamentally talking about individuals. 6 million makes no sense. 10 million makes no sense. I have no idea what that is. I've never, individuals matter. They were people with back to shoes. And in many cases, there were people who haven't had no one to remember them. And I think that is really, it isn't just a Jewish sensation. I think it is fundamentally a human sensation that we want to believe and we need to know that there is someone who will remember us and who will validate our experience, not only our death, but our life. And so I think that the commemoration of the victims individually, in families, in communities, and all together is fundamentally is fundamentally important as a moral value. I do agree with Professor Wagner. It's not enough to say never again. We all say never again. And anyway, it's happened again and again and again in other forms in other places. But I think it is really important to learn not only about the evil, but also about the good. There are stories that we can rescue, that we can unearth, of incredible beauty and kindness. Susan mentioned Primo Levi. He speaks about the sun on his face. There are stories of incredible beauty and courage and generosity and extraordinary dignity and integrity. And these are the things that we must rescue. And I think that's also a commemoration, not just about the ashes that you walk on when you're trampling through Birkenau, but those acts of deep humanity. And they will save us as nothing else will.
Can I just sort of come back to this just for a second to say, I'm not against commemoration. It wasn't what I meant. I just see that right now we're in a moment historically where authoritarian governments are surging all over the world, and where there needs to be some larger understanding of the kinds of circumstances that bring that about, and more analytic thinking. And so while I'm not saying commemoration shouldn't happen, I think the emphasis right now maybe needs to be on, yes, how did this come about? And because I think we're in a bit of trouble in the world right now, perhaps more trouble than we've been in since then.
I think that's an unfortunate but appropriate point to unfortunately bring our panel to an end. It's interesting. My work is with young people, and particularly with citizenship education, how to get young people to engage in politics and in society. And it's quite clear that the lessons of the past, and as Professor Wagner said, coming to terms of history, historical consciousness, are integral parts of that process. At the same time, acts of commemoration and remembrance are deeply powerful ways that young people can connect with the past, even when they don't have that direct connection to the memory of the past. And I think in all your presentations and in the work that you do, there is a sense in which there is a progressive work towards getting the next generations to hopefully learn the lessons from the past in the way that maybe, unfortunately, current generations may not. I'd like to thank you all for basically providing a stimulating an hour's worth of debate. I came here not as an expert, and I've learned an enormous amount in the space of an hour. So I thank all of you for your thoughtful responses. I also like to thank the Wiener Holocaust Library for their kind invitation to chair this evening. And to conclude tonight, to pass back over to Imogen Dalzale to conclude tonight's proceedings. But thank you very much to all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. I will try and keep my closing remarks brief. I'm aware that we're slightly over time already. As you said, there's always so much to say. You could sit here for hours just listening to these fascinating conversations. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Dr. Mycock for chairing so superbly and keeping us relatively to time. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Professor Dan Stone and Dr. Christine Schmidt, who have been co-hosting and helping out behind the scenes this evening. And also, of course, to our audience for your engagement and for your questions and comments. Just to quickly say that we have one more event in the Death Marches Evidence and Memory series. Next Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time, we will be back on Zoom and we'll be joined by Manfred Goldberg, who I know is in the audience tonight as well, who will be sharing his experiences of his Death March journey in conversation with Professor Dan Stone. I will be sending out a link in the email tomorrow after the event to all our attendees. Also to say that the other panel discussions we've had in this series are on our YouTube channel. This will also be going up as a recording tomorrow. Again, there will be a link in that in tomorrow's email. And if you would like to see the exhibition, if you're able to, then Death Marches Evidence of Memory is on display at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London until the 27th of August, and another version on at the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre in Huddersfield until the 1st of September. So again, I will put more information about that tomorrow. But again, just to say thank you all very, very much. Have a very pleasant afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Bye.